Hey guys, this short video is going to teach you how to build a training program. So by now we should have done our activity analysis, done our needs analysis of the relevant fitness components, and now we need to actually build a periodized training program to elicit some chronic adaptations. Now before we get into training programs, we need to talk about the training principles. Once we know our training principles, then we can build a specifically tailored training program to that individual. So the first training principle I want to talk about is specificity. Specificity is pretty straightforward. It just means that we want the training program to be specific to the sport that we are undertaking. So for example, if we want to improve our 10-kilometer running time, most of that program is going to be surrounding running as the type of activity that we're going to do. Just like if we were cycling, we would do cycling. Okay, if you're doing a program for hockey, that's mostly running, so we would do more more running-based training than we would cycling or swimming or other cross-training methods. So we just want the training program to be as specific to the demands of the activity as possible. The next one, which I've bolded because we need to talk about this for building an actual training program, is progressive overload. So we want to progressively overload by 2 to 10% every week. That is a safe, structured way to periodize a program. Now, overload or load is made up of three components. One is time, which is just the duration. So for example, running for 30 minutes, the duration or the time is 30 minutes, multiplied by the intensity. Now the intensity can be a number of things. It could be rating of perceived exertion. You could do a 1 to 10 rating of a perceived exertion scale. There's another one that's 6 to 20. You could do percentage of max heart rate. You could do percentage of VO2 max. There's multiple ways that you can measure intensity. One is not better than the other. You just need to pick one and then be consistent with that throughout the program, just so we can get a measure of the actual intensity of the training sessions. And finally, the frequency. That's how many times per week that we are training. So load is frequency, times per week, multiplied by the duration, multiplied by the intensity. We'll come to that in a sec. The next training principle is the type. So that's to do, are we running, are we cycling, are we rowing, the type of activity being undertaken, are we doing continuous training, interval training, so on and so forth. Variety is just to do with, hey look, a training program is going to be very boring if I just say, all right, 4 times a week, go out for a 20-minute continuous run at an RPE of 5 out of 10. Okay, that is going to be very boring. So to keep motivation high, we need to provide variety, whether that be, let's throw in some cross training, a bike session, for example, or we throw in some other training methods, which we'll talk about later, things like long interval training or short interval training or HIIT training, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of different types of sessions that we can do to create variety. Maintenance, we need to do 2 times a week just to maintain. So what this basically means is that a training program for the purpose of improving performance in terms of eliciting chronic adaptations, we need to do 3 times a week, because if 2 times a week is maintenance, so just staying the same, then we need 3 times to actually improve performance. Diminishing returns is basically, there's going to come a point where, two reasons. One, if you don't provide much variety, you're going to start to get diminishing returns. So you're going to get a plateau in your performance. If you just go and do bench press day after day, bench press, eventually you're going to find a weight that you can't sort of overcome because you're getting diminishing returns. What you need to do is attack that variable in a different way. So instead of just doing a bench press, you do some fly pulls, or you do a different exercise to get a different stimulus on that muscle group. The other thing is, when you are reaching peak fitness, you are going to get diminishing returns, all right? So you're going to get a rapid improvement in fitness very quickly at the beginning of a training program, but as you get toward your peak fitness, it's going to be pretty hard to get that extra couple of percent, and that's when you need to be quite strategic with your variety and with the training methods that you do to peak performance. Overtraining and detraining. Overtraining is simply an unhealthy breakdown of the immune system. So it's basically when you don't follow this 2 to 10% rule, you are at risk of overtraining, and what that can do is lots of things. Your immune system can break down. You can get sick. You can get injured. You can get lethargic, demotivated. A whole lot of negative psychological influences that can happen on you, that can occur to you. Overtraining is basically you training too much, and detraining is obviously the opposite. It's a reversal in your adaptation. So rather than so if we just do nothing, so we know here we need to do 2 times a week just to maintain our fitness. If we just stop our training altogether, we're going to detrain. We'll get a reversal of our chronic adaptation. So instead of, say, increasing the number, size, and surface area of mitochondria, it's going to go the other way. We're going to get a poorer VO2 max, and we're going to get muscle atrophy instead of hypertrophy, so our muscles will shrink, so on and so forth. So if we use it or lose it, if we stop training, we will get a reversal in our chronic adaptations. And the last one is individuality. This is simply saying that, a training program is 50% science and 50% art. So it's all well and good following all the training principles above, but at the end of the day, individuality is very, very important. What works for one person may not work for another person, okay? And also you've got to take into account things like injury history and that sort of stuff. If somebody has a history of plantar fasciitis in their foot, then you're going to have to tackle that very differently to somebody who is perfectly healthy and has a large track record of clocking up hundreds of Ks a week in running. Okay, so for the purpose of today, building a training program, the ones that we're looking at is progressive overload, the time, intensity, and frequency. And what we're going to do now is take a look at two different examples, one being a strength program and one being an endurance program. Before we get into that, so in the endurance program, so session load is intensity multiplied by duration. So that could be, intensity could be RPE, as we said, it could be a percentage of maximum heart rate, it could be a percentage of VO2 max, okay? Duration is simply the number of minutes. When we talk about a strength program, the session load, again, is intensity and duration, that doesn't change, but the intensity component is the weight lifted, for example, 50 kilograms, and the duration is the total repetitions. Let's take a look at the example that I've got on the board, and then we'll come back. All right, so let's start off with the strength program. It's a little bit more basic to understand, given that the load is a lot easier to monitor. So we know that load is frequency multiplied by intensity multiplied by duration. So with strength, the example I'm going to use here is, let's say we're training 4 times per week, that's our frequency. We're doing 3 sets of 10 reps of a bench press, for example, at 30 kilograms. So what we don't want to do first is figure out, we know the frequency is 4, that's easy. The intensity is going to be 30 kilos, and the duration in this circumstance is the total number of times that we lift the weight. So what we want to do is figure out total times lifted. So 3 sets of 10 is 30 times that we're lifting 30 kilograms. So that means that in a single session, we have 900, in this one we can actually give it a metric, 900 kilograms of load. That is what we have lifted in a single session. If we are lifting that, and we're doing that same session 4 times a week, 4 times by 900 gives us a base load of 3,600 kilograms for the week. Down the bottom here we have weeks, 0 through to 8, and then we have our load. In this example, it's load in kilograms, starting at 3,600, which is our base here, all the way up to, we've got 5,000 at the top here. So we know that we need to progressively overload 2 to 10% per week. So what that means is, if this is my base load of 3,600, it means if I can add on 10%, I'll just quickly do the math here, it means we can go up to a total of 3,960 kilograms of weight lifted in the next week. Okay, so that's our base. Now 10%, how can we do this? Let's keep it simple. If I change it from 4 times a week to 5 times a week and nothing else changes, well, that's an increase in 20%. That's too much overload. If I change it to 4 sets instead of 3 sets, then again, that's still too much overload. That's going to be an increase of 25%. What I could easily do is, instead of doing 10 repetitions each set, I could do 11 repetitions. That would be a 10% increase. That would be appropriate overload. Likewise, I could increase the intensity part. I keep all this the same, but instead of lifting 30 kilograms, I could go up to 33 kilograms. That would be a 10% increase. So for example, let's say we go from 30 to 33, do the math down here. So we're still doing 30 reps in total, but now it's by 33. It should be that number I just saw. 990. 990 times by 4, that's my dog, sorry about that, equals 3,960. So that's exactly a 10% increase. So that's somewhere around here for the next week. And then we do the same thing for the next week. So 1, 2, 3. Generally what we do is we do a 3-week build. So up by 2 to 10% each week. And then we do about a 25% reduction in our training load to recover. So week 4 we would come down about 25%. Now the way we come down 25%, we're not allowed to change the intensity. Just like with tapering, we can't change the intensity, it must stay the same. So what that means is, if we work, in this example, the intensity is the weight lifted. If we were at 33 kilos, we need to keep it at 33 kilos. So how can we reduce by 25%? Well, either of these things. A really easy one is instead of doing it 4 times a week, let's do it 3 times a week, keep everything else exactly the same. That's a 25% reduction, but the intensity is the same. We could also reduce the sets, we also could reduce the reps, whatever it is, but we must keep intensity the same. We would then go up the next week, up 10%, up, so on and so forth. We're just progressively getting, increasing the load so that we improve our performance that way. Let's go to an endurance program. And this one's a little bit trickier because intensity can be quite tricky to measure. Okay, so 4 times a week again, pretty straightforward. This time we're doing 60 minutes, that's our duration. And our intensity I've chosen as 5 rating of perceived exertion, 5 out of 10 on an RPE scale. Now intensity, we can do percentage max heart rate, we can do percentage VO2 max, we can do rating of perceived exertion. Pick one, doesn't really matter. In this example, we're talking about arbitrary units of load because I'm using RPE. So this number doesn't really mean anything. All it is a baseline, and we know that we need to increase that load baseline each week. 0 to 8 down the bottom here as well. Okay, so let's say if we're again, same thing. Let's figure out, for 4 times a week is our frequency, 60 times 5. 60 times 5 is 300. So the sessional load is 300 arbitrary units of load, RPE. 4 times a week equals 369, 1200, okay, which we have down here. So our base load of 1200. Same thing, 2 to 10% per week. If we just change it to 5 times, that's going to be a 20% increase, too much. If we go from an RPE of 5 to an RPE of 6, that Tyler is about a 20% increase as well in intensity. So if you change intensity or you change the frequency, it's really dramatically going to change the load. So the easiest thing to do is just the duration aspect, all right? We can go from still 4 times a week, still same intensity of 5 RPE, but instead of 60 minutes, we can go to 66 minutes. Okay, I've increased that individual metric by 10%. That would put us at 66 by 5 is 330. That makes sense. Which equals times by 4, 1320. So that's that increase to about here. And then we increase it the next week, similar metrics. So instead of 66, we go to like 72, 73 minutes, so on and so forth, up again. And then we deload by 25%. Same thing, 25%, we could just easily go from 4 times a week to 3 times a week. That's easy. Could we reduce, we could reduce that, if 60 was the example, 60 minutes, we could reduce that to 45 pretty easily to get a 25% decrease. RPE, again, we don't want to change intensity, so we must maintain that same RPE of 5. In a future video, I'm going to go into some more specific examples of how we can sort of change the ins and outs of the session. But for the sake of VCEP, all we want to know is that load is frequency times by duration times by the intensity. We want to overload it 2 to 10% per week. Probably the easiest way to do it, if you can, is just by increasing the duration by 10%, because if you change the frequency, that's normally a pretty significant percentage change overall, as is the intensity. When we deload or when we reduce the volume to allow for recovery, just like in a taper where we would normally do it 50%, we must keep the intensity the same, all right? So it's just about making these numbers work, overloading these numbers by 2 to 10% per week, and that is a safe way to progressively overload a training program.